It's late, that kind of late where the world softens, when the emails have stopped and the noise has quieted and the expectations loosen their grip a bit. And your house settles and your family's asleep and the streets are empty and the lights dim. And for some reason, it's often there, in the quiet, in the dark, in the space where no one's watching, that the real questions begin to rise up. Not the questions that we ask out loud, but the ones we carry. The ones that sit just beneath the surface of our lives. Questions like, am I enough? Does my life matter? God, there's got to be more than this. Where are you in all of this? Why does faith feel so clear for those people, but not for me? How do the parts of my story connect to the things I don't even understand? What if I've been wrong this whole time? What if I'm afraid to be honest about what I actually believe? John tells us a story about a man who came to Jesus in the dark. His name was Nicodemus, but before we push past him, it helps to know who Nicodemus is. Nicodemus isn't a skeptic setting outside of faith. Nicodemus is an insider to religion. He's a Pharisee. Now, I don't know about you, but probably the worst thing you could be called as a churchgoer today is a Pharisee. But I think we got to back that up a little bit, maybe erase that. In fact, if you have never read the Catholic Bible, the one that has a few extra books in the center, you don't even know what a Pharisee is, right? Because the Old Testament doesn't have Pharisees, and the New Testament just starts with them. And what you get is this weird picture. But a Pharisee in the time of Jesus were actually really devoted people. There's these 400 years in the middle between the Hebrew Bible and our New Testament. These 400 years where the way that people felt God in that moment was that they said God was silent, that God had stopped speaking. Well, what do you do if you're a person of faith and you haven't heard God for 400 years? And that answer to that question created a bunch of different religious groups who were trying to figure out what they should do. And one of those were the Pharisees. And the Pharisees said, man, you should go back to the last thing God said. If God hasn't said something new, I'm going to go back to the thing that I know he said. And so they collected all 600 plus rules of God. And then they were like, we just got to do these and make sure everybody does these and create a lot of systems where we can do these things so that maybe we'll hear God again. John tells us that Nicodemus is a leader of the Jews. So he's not just a Pharisee. Likely he was a part of the Sanhedrin, which included the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes. It was the ruling council. So this guy coming to Jesus in the middle of the night is a guy who's trying to be faithful, but he's bound up by a lot of rules. He's respected, he's educated, he's trusted, he's established. And if there's anyone in this story who was supposed to have faith figured out, it was Nicodemus. And yet he comes at night. Why does he come in the middle of the night? Some people say that he's afraid, that he doesn't want to be seen hanging out with Jesus, that it could cost him his reputation, his standing, maybe even his place in the community. Other scholars are saying he's just being cautious. Some scholars are like, well, that's just when you talk to people, right, at night. And some say he just wanted some uninterrupted time. And maybe it's all of that, but I also wonder if night is the only time where Nicodemus can finally be honest about his self, because he's worried about everybody else. He's the one who has all the answers during the day, right? People come to him to find out, am I doing the right thing? Am I not? So during the day, he teaches. During the day, he holds the structure together. But at night, he has questions. And he comes to Jesus and he says, Rabbi, we know that you're a teacher who's come from God. Good beginning, right? Careful, measured, respectful, right? Like Jesus is doing all of these things in the community and he's a religious leader. And you can imagine all of the people coming to him and being like, you need to get this Jesus guy under control. He's breaking all the rules. He's eating the wrong things. He's talking to the wrong people. Like, what are you doing? And yet something in him is percolating. It's like, God's doing something. But imagine after 400 years of not really seeing God do something, the doubt that begins to pop in your mind about, is this God or was it pizza? Or whatever. You can almost hear him trying to hold on to what he already knows while simultaneously reaching for something new. And before he even gets into his questions, Jesus responds. And I think you can read this as like Jesus and him having a little bit of a skirmish, or you can read it as two really smart people of God being like, you think? What about the back and forth and the play in the words? And Jesus says, very truly, I tell you, no one can come to the kingdom of God without being born from above. Nicodemus is like, what? You can feel the confusion. Born again? What are you talking about? How can anyone be born after growing old? Can somebody enter their mother's womb a second time? It's humorous. But underneath is something deeply human. Nicodemus is trying to make sense of something that doesn't fit inside his paradigm. He's been given this structure, this box, and he's wanting Jesus to talk about what's in the box. But Jesus doesn't want to talk about what's in the box because staying in the box is missing the point. So Jesus starts throwing things at him outside the box, inviting him to leave his box for a minute. And this is where the story begins to open up for us, because many of us were taught in ways subtle and explicit that faith means having all the right answers. That belief is about certainty. That doubt is something to move past as quickly as possible. That questions are simply problems that we have to solve. But here for Nicodemus, this faithful, devoted, sincere man standing in front of Jesus and asking questions that don't have any easy answers. And here's what's, I think, striking about the story. Jesus doesn't shame him. He doesn't dismiss him and say, it's too late, Nicodemus. He doesn't say, Nicodemus, you should know all this by now. He just stays with him in this back and forth, inviting him to step outside of the space of comfort. And he speaks in images, metaphors. Jesus starts talking about the water. Well, it's like the water. And Nicodemus, you have wind, right? How do you explain the wind? It blows this way and that, and you know the power of the wind, but how do you know the wind? And then spirit, and using these words like breath of God to describe what is happening. In other words, Nicodemus, there's something about the life of God that cannot be controlled or managed or fully explained in your little box. There's something about this life that moves, that surprises, that refuses to stay inside the categories we've built. And Nicodemus, still stuck in his box, says, Jesus, how can these things be? But you can hear it. Less defensive, a little more open, a little more curious. Something is shifting inside of him. And this is the movement of the story. Not from doubt to certainty, but from certainty to curiosity. See, many of us grew up in worlds that told us that the opposite of faith was doubt, and we should do everything we can to never doubt anything. But lest we forget that the definition of faith is believing in things you can't see. Doubt is a part of faith. What's not is certainty. Certainty is where we get trapped. It's the openness that awakens us to that there is more that we can possibly understand or explain in the midst of this journey. And this is where faith begins. Not at the end of our questions, but right in the middle of them. In my work, I get to see and talk with and engage people who have stepped away from faith. And 90% of them, it's not because they've stopped caring or that they have an issue with Jesus. It's because they've never been given a place to ask, to doubt, to ask questions about Scripture and how they're holding those, and questions about the suffering that they're experiencing in their everyday life, and questions about science and faith and how these things play and don't play together, and questions about their identity and who they are, and what if it feels different than what might be the norm, and questions about the church, and questions about God. And somewhere along the way, they get the message that to belong, you need to have everything resolved about those questions first. But this story offers us something different. Nicodemus belongs in the conversation before he even understands it. He's welcomed into the mystery before he can even explain it. He's held by Jesus in the tension of not knowing. And something begins to change in him. Because here's the thing we often miss. Nicodemus doesn't disappear after John 3. He shows up again in John's story. In chapter 7, he's with this group of people who are all also in their boxes, and they're talking about Jesus, and they're going at who Jesus is, and it's Nicodemus who quietly stands up and says, "Hey, I don't think you fully understand." And in chapter 19, when Jesus has been crucified, it's Nicodemus who appears again, this time in the middle of the day, helping to prepare Jesus' body for burial and giving mixtures of aloe and myrrh. This is an act of courage, of care, of love. The man who came in the dark eventually steps into the light, not at once, but over time, through questions and through wrestling and through staying, and that matters. Because in most of our stories, transformation rarely happens in a single moment. Usually it unfolds, it grows, it deepens. Like roots finding their way into the soil, like breath returning into our lungs after holding it for so long, like dawn slowly breaking after a long night. So what do we do with our questions? The ones that we carry quietly, the ones that we're not sure we're allowed to ask, the ones that feel complicated or too fragile or too unfinished or not enough clarity. The invitation is to not silence them and not rush to resolve them, but maybe the invitation is to bring them to God, to bring them to a trusted person in your life, to bring them to community, to bring them to the table. Because what if your questions are not obstacles to faith, but the opening? What if your questions are not signs that something is wrong in you, but signs that something has come alive again? What if your questions are where God is already at work, like he was in John, gently, patiently drawing him into something deeper? There's a line in this passage that is often read quickly, almost automatically, because we see it at every football game in America. For God so loved the world. And we hear it We've heard it before. But in this conversation, in the middle of confusion and curiosity and unanswered questions, those words land differently. God so loved the world, Nicodemus. Not once the world had everything figured out. Not once belief was settled. Not once clarity was achieved. In fact, we skip over 3:16 and you move to 17, and I think that is really spoken to the heart of the Pharisee. Nicodemus, God didn't come into the world to condemn the world. If you think this is what this is about, you're missing the whole picture. God came into the world so the world might be free, so the world might know God and what your life is like when you tap into the source who moves and makes all things be. Right there in the middle of it. See, God's love doesn't wait for our certainty. It meets us in our questions and moves toward us in the dark. And God's love stays with us. So I wonder what questions you're bringing these days. The ones that may feel like everything might change if you ask them. The ones that you can barely name. The ones that show up when things get quiet. Nicodemus comes in the night, but he leaves without everything fully resolved. But still, he leaves changed, more open, more aware, more alive to the movement of God. And that's enough for now. Not easy answers that create a new box that he can just get into and replace the old one. But a willingness to stay and to listen and to be curious and to trust that God is present in the unfolding because the story is still being written. In Nicodemus, in us, in the quiet places where questions arise, and in the spaces that we dare bring them into the light. And perhaps faith is less about arriving to certainty and more about staying in relationship with the God who meets us in whatever space we're in. Some of you are sitting here and being like, I don't have any questions, Rustin. You should work on that. Please pray with me. Gracious God, we meet you in this space and you meet us in whatever space we're in. And so we come, bringing you our stuff, unfolding, becoming. Meet us here.